Welcome, and I'm so delighted to be here. I am not a member of the university academic staff of University of Pretoria, but I feel so embraced, and I'm delighted actually to be here. So I first want to say what a delight it is in terms of the organization of this seminar come book launch today, and I want to warmly welcome all of you, and I thank you for your presence. So we have really esteemed guests this afternoon, and I want to say a special thank you to them. We know your diaries are really busy and that you've made the time for what is really a significant area, both on the continent and in particular in Southern Africa. So I'd like to begin by, why the seminar, and of course, why this time? So most of us here, and the other thing that I would like to add is that it's really wonderful to be connecting with people that I have known for more than 2 decades and whose research interacts very much with mine, and that you are present here today. You are really scholars who are contributing to the development of the field, both on the continent and in the country. So why this theme, why this time? So firstly, sexuality is has always been, or mainly been represented in terms of danger, disease, and damage. The ways in which sexuality pervades the kind of discourse around public health, and particularly in terms of gender, sexuality is marked by its negativity. But if I take the words of Deleuze, who says sexuality is everywhere, and the words of Jeffrey Weeks, who says sexuality is the air that we breathe. And this afternoon, I want to say how we need to embrace the fact that sexuality is indeed everywhere, and that the ways in which we negotiate our everyday lives is indeed the sexual air that we breathe. And to deny it means to deny the realities of everyday life. At the same time, while sexuality is the air that we breathe, there are many things that have been squeezed out of understanding sexuality more comprehensively. And one of the main issues, I would say, is the notion of affective notions around sexuality, desire, and pleasure. And Mark Hunter puts it nicely in his 2010 book when he says sexuality has been, or pleasure and desire has been squeezed out of sexuality. And so what are we trying to do in the seminar is really to squeeze it back in and to build and contribute to the developing work on sexuality in this country and in this region. Now, the fact that sexuality is been, positioned in this binary logics of pleasure and of course the opposite, which is the danger discourse in which we inhabit through public health work and through the popular discourse, means that there is much more work to do if we are to understand sexuality in its broader or broadly conceived. And so the notions about love, about desire, about the everyday lives through which men and women navigate, boys and girls too, the ways in which sexuality is beyond the heteronormative gaze, that sexuality is not simply about an inclusion of gender and sexual diversity, but it is also about understanding genders and sexualities. And we try to do this. We try to bring forth the emerging research that is a point of departure from the kind of dominant logic in which these issues remain marginalized. I have to say that many of you sitting here, including scholars like Vasuridi, Pumla, Gokola, are making inroads into changing that narrative. And we need to understand what might be thinkable at this point in time. How does the social, political, economic, and cultural context allow for different ways of imagining sexuality? At the heart of sexuality and sexual health is notions around gender and, of course, the surrounding social and economic milieu. Now, in relation to gender, the focus on men as predators and women as in a perpetual state of suffering is one that we also are trying to revise. So men are not these, notwithstanding the statistics which suggest to us that South Africa is and remains a violent country, and we will never dismiss the realities that women and girls face on a daily basis, but to broadly homogenize men as these hypersexual predators is really to miss the point about how sexuality is lived and experienced, and also to recognize that the affective dimensions really need to be taken seriously if we are to increase our theoretical tools about how we understand sexuality. So with that, I would like to welcome you to this really remarkable session. I also want to say that, you know, post-COVID, this is my first time presenting at an on-site event. And I know for many of us here as well, the online has been our staple. And so it's also with such great delight that this human contact is now being reestablished. I would now like to welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, whom I've known for many years. And I also would like to say to the Dean and to the rest of you that University of Pretoria is really becoming a vibrant center in terms of sexuality. And it really makes me so envious that this institution is pushing forward, and I really commend and congratulate the faculty in particular and the academics who are doing remarkable work around this area. I mean, most recently, this faculty hosted the Transnational Contact Zones Conference, which I also attended online. And I have to say that with that, it really has ignited the sense that this University of Pretoria, the Faculty of Humanities, can really become a gem on the continent in terms of sexuality research. With that, I would like to welcome Professor Vasu Reddy to introduce our Vice-Chancellor.
Thanks very much, Divya, and of course, Mary, and online Peter Aggleton. Thank you so much, and a good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the seminar and, of course, this wonderful book, the launch of this book, Troubling Others, Thinking Otherwise, Gender, Sexuality, and Sexual Health in Southern Africa. We're so privileged to have colleagues from a number of universities across the country and the world join us today, both in person and, of course, those of you joining us online. The University of Pretoria is increasingly, I think, and thanks, Divya, for saying that, a hub, together with others, for research on sexualities in South Africa and on the continent. And as a faculty, we're really actively encouraging a critical engagement with sexuality and, of course, sexuality-related issues and its intersectional dimensions, of course. Several scholars in humanities, particularly in sociology, psychology, as well as departments such as anthropology, are particularly interested in this line of research and have published widely in this area. And thanks, Divya, as well. As many will know, I'm also personally, professionally invested in this particular field. And thanks also for sharing with us, and I didn't know that you were online for this conference. Just last month, we hosted the Transnational Contact Zones, African and South Asian Sexualities and Genders, a hybrid international conference which drew over 120 scholars and including activists from South Africa, India, the UK, US, who presented insightful perspectives. I'm also delighted to say something about our Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender, based within the Faculty of Humanities, but has a campus-wide remit and draws students from across faculties into its work. And some of the themes that the center explores includes issues that we are all so familiar with: gender-based justice, sexual diversity and citizenship, and of course the challenges and dynamics of gender, race, identity, and class. And of course, beyond the university, the CSANG partners with many organizations and is a member of several networks. And these include our Center for Human Rights based at the UP, the Stop Gender-Based Violence campaign, Gender Research at UP, and of course, the Gender Justice Partnership. The center has also hosted a writing competition with several South African schools, particularly the debating board, giving high school students in particular an opportunity to discuss important issues facing our country. Each year since 2019, the CSANG Press has published some really top-notch entries as a collection. And the centers, of course, produced exciting publications on gender, sexuality, and gender justice in South Africa. Of course, although research on sexuality, sex, and gender is wide and continuously expanding, much of it focuses on biomedical issues. And of course, this perpetuates a status quo response to the nuanced challenges of sexuality and gender. And not nearly enough attention is paid, as we've heard, to other dimensions: pleasure, risk, diversity, and of course, personal experiences. These are key issues in rethinking sexuality, indeed, to use the metaphor of the title, to trouble preconceived ideas and meanings about sexuality. As the editors of this pioneering book state in the introduction, the developing research agenda suggests a shift away from almost exclusive focus on violence and sexual risk to a concern for justice and thinking sex otherwise. And of course, today's event is part of a continuous effort to bring scholars and of course activists together to further develop the exciting body of knowledge in sexuality studies. The value, I believe, of a positive and respectful approach that neither romanticizes the past nor condemns the present is often undervalued. We must be careful not to overlook the injustices and oppressions that scholars studying sexuality have also endured. All periods, in several ways, produce social anxieties, induced in part by moral and sex panics. But we, as scholars and activists, can use events such as this to help create a greater understanding about sexual and gender diversity and identity. The publication, then, that we launch today is an important step in this process because it addresses the dominant discourses around issues of pleasure, risk, diversity, and, of course, personal experiences. This is why it's so encouraging to see such a wide range of authors and backgrounds represented in this pioneering volume. And while the contributing authors do represent a strong research focus, there are others who are also exploring other areas. I hope we will hear from some of them in the discussion to be held a little later. It is my sincere hope that this will be the first of a continuing series of discussions and lively debates, not only here at UP, but certainly beyond the university as well. And so before we begin, a few housekeeping announcements. Perhaps we should have said that earlier. Please switch off those important attachments that we have, your cellular phones. And of course, today's program will include 2 discussion sessions, one a critical questions panel, which will be introduced and moderated by Divya Bana and Mary Crew, and the other is an open discussion. And I'd like to encourage our audience members, both online and in person, to participate. But for now, I have the honor to introduce Prof. Tawana, who will give us a few introductory remarks. Prof. Cooper, as many might know, and we've heard from people like Divya Bana, has been of most visible and sterling support for all our initiatives to think beyond silos, to enlarge our worldviews in inclusive, critical, and imaginative ways. He needs little introduction, but allow me to share a short bio sketch. Prof. Cooper is, as you know, our Vice Chancellor and Principal, and he's been with us since the 14th of January 2019. He does remind us all, but it seems that it just happened yesterday. He brings, of course, a wealth of leadership, teaching, and research, including edited volumes and co-authored books and articles, and major public intellectual contributions. Trained in Zimbabwe and Norway, he is a professor of media studies and the founding head of media studies at Wits University. We at UP, and I'm sure those of you elsewhere, are witness to his energy and dedication, and more importantly, commitment to the academic project, and indeed, real and meaningful change. Beyond all the accomplishments, I wish to also highlight Prof. Cooper's significant contributions to building academic partnerships across the African continent, indeed the globe, and for his leadership in the transformation of higher education at a global level. He's led several fundraising initiatives as well as collaborative agreements with many universities and was elected chairperson for Africa in the Australia-Africa Universities Network. Prof. Cooper, thank you, as always, in spite of your hectic schedule, for always making time for us. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Prof. Reddy. I nearly did what I learned from Ms. Naledi, Dr. Naledi Pando, graduate of the university. If you go over a certain limit introducing her, she comes towards you and almost nudges you. Oh, but very kind of you, and a great pleasure, everyone, to be here. And good afternoon and welcome to all the participants of this seminar, in particular to the keynote speaker, Professor Phumla Gqola. We go a long way back at that institution across the river. We don't mention by name. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to Future Africa. I would also like to acknowledge that this is a joint function with the Education Faculty at UKZN and University of South Wales Centre for Social Research in Australia, who graciously agreed that we could host the function here at the University of Pretoria. I welcome the authors and all students who have joined us from other universities, as well as colleagues and students from the University of Pretoria. This event, which is one of the last formal events at UP to mark Women's Month, something we have to rethink also and reimagine why one Women's Month out of 12, reminds us that while we may focus on women's issues more acutely during this month, debate and discussing must of course continue to take this focus forward. Young people today have a privilege that few of our parents had. That is the freedom and liberty and the right to openly debate sex, sexuality, and sexual health, and to understand that the old, rather restrictive gender binary has been challenged, and a range of different forms of gender and sexuality expressions can be lived and celebrated. Often, society is slow to understand and embrace the wider identities that now exist. However, it would be wrong to call them new, for many of them have been in existence for as long as we have. For too long, gender and sexuality minorities among us have been hidden, ridiculed, abused, and debased. But what we are able to do now, led by young people and critical scholars and NGOs, is to widen our debates and understanding, to open new spaces for people to reflect on their experiences. We are proud that these debates take front and center stage at the University of Pretoria and in many other institutions. Our partnership with UKZN being a demonstration of one. One of the first publications to bring together studies of African sexualities was a reader compiled by Sylvia Tamale, the famous academic scholar and activist that many of you know. In the acknowledgements, she wrote, "Developing this reader was an incredibly enriching and joyous experience." She added, "I wish to thank all the scholars and activists around the continent who, against all odds, have kept the fires of freedom, dignity, and change burning, and play a part in sharpening the critical thinking of its readers, and nudging along the broader African struggle for transformation. While we too are engaged in this process of sharpening our critical thinking, we have to, at the same time, recognize that we live in a country and a region with extraordinarily high levels of gender abuse, sexual and gender violence, and indeed, you cannot say this in our region and in our country without saying, and femicide, and ongoing discrimination against women, the wider LGBTIQ plus community, and transgender people. It is, not to abuse the term, it is, in certain senses, feels and is a pandemic in its own right. When we talk about the critical freedoms that come with open discussions about gender identity and sexuality, we must also know that this freedom can bring with it unspeakable violence and abuse. It is like the bright side and the dark side of the moon. On the one hand, there exists for increasing numbers of Africans a sexual freedom and identity that is vibrant, new and ever-changing, but on the other side, there remain ongoing patterns of violence and abuse that erode human rights and dignity, and indeed, I would go on to say all of our humanity. Because no form of violence is just violence against the person, the person that we often frame as a victim. It's also the violation of that person themselves who's perpetrating violence. That is why I believe it compromises all of our humanity. Part of our broader African struggle for transformation is to find ways to understand what shapes this violence, the ways in which we have failed to embrace the majority of men in our work, and the best ways in which to get people to embrace the new rather than to fight for the old and to maintain, by whatever means, the status quo. In the flyer for this seminar this afternoon, it states, sex and sexuality and sexual health are often viewed through a narrowly biomedical lens. This ignores the fact that they are profoundly social and historical in character. Recent work in Southern Africa and beyond has sought to challenge this perspective, asking important questions about how to move beyond notions of damage and risk in relation to sex, sexuality, and health, and to a focus on recognitions, rights, respect, and pleasure. This publication and event today, by the way, the publication is actually here. I'm likely to escape with it when I do. These narratives and perceptions seeking new ways of understanding and engaging with the old issues that so often bedevil our work. This book is structured around 4 major themes: gender and sexual diversity, love, pleasure, and respect, gender violence and health, sexuality, gender, and sexual justice. The editors make the point that framing sex, sexuality, and sexual health in Southern Africa as tied to sexual rights, pleasure, and justice is one of the most profound developments in the region in the last 30 years. It is this focus on sexual justice and rights that provide new understandings in the expansion of what it is possible to do and know of the field of sexuality and sexual health. The contributions in this book move away from the usual naming and blaming. The links between sexual identity and violence, alongside increasing interest in diverse genders and sexualities, there has been a burgeoning of research on love, affection, intimacy, and desire. Notably, the developing research agenda suggests a shift away from an almost exclusive focus on violence and sexual risk to one of thinking sex otherwise, or as the discussion today put it, troubling others, thinking otherwise. Troubling others and thinking otherwise is an essential part of challenging the ways in which research in sexuality has been done in the past. We do indeed need to trouble others. We need to ask critical questions and unsettle their certainties. We can do this through hearing the voices of those whose identities, sexual and pleasure, trouble others. We need to create ways of critical understanding that we should be looking forward to new possibilities and not backwards to ways of defending the old. We need to develop this analysis and to think about how, in a range of fields and disciplines. We create, quote unquote, the other, the outsider, the excluded, and those who need to fight for space and their own inclusion. Troubling others also means opening up the research, the debates, and the narratives. It means not accepting the taken for granted certainties of how people see others, but seeing instead what is so troubling about the traditional visions and understanding of sexuality and sex that disempower women and cause what is a natural gender and sexual diversity to be misrecognized as something wrong. Kopane Oratele, who is also a contributing author in this book, who I'm proud to say will be giving a major speech soon here at this here August University. I don't know myself, I'm just a vice chancellor. We at our academic achievers, and also launching his book, which I think Pumla is also a very interesting book, you will agree. Why Women Hate Men, Kopane will be reaching. So it's a continued in this series, why men hate women, sorry. Wrote in the African Sexualities reader, men and women who have sexual preferences that are other than heterosexual generate anxiety and disorder in the dominant order of masculinity because their identity around X other than those that uphold order of gendered sexualities. Lino Manderson and her co-authors, including Blessings Kaunda Kamwambwa, who is present today, right, I didn't see where she is, values and practices relating to sexuality, reproduction, and health in Southern Africa are informed and complicated by diverse social, cultural, and economic and political structures. Our aim in this chapter is to challenge assumptions of homogeneous life patterns and unsettle normalized discourses so as to counter generalities that have negative effects on populations in the regions. Interventions, they argue, impacting these fields include in relation to HIV and gender-based violence, have dominated neoliberal regimes in Southern Africa, but with very little understanding of how and why sexual and reproductive health injustices recur throughout our region. In their chapter, they seek to illuminate how contemporary theory, policy, and practice normalize and conceal injustices and use sexuality as a tool for population governance or plainly control. They show too how biomedical knowledge and resultant discourses have shaped this agenda, primarily through an HIV-focused lens. Health prioritization and financing have largely followed this pattern, while neglecting to address institutional and structural vulnerabilities deeply embedded in the region. P.A. Broward and Christy Kruger, also here today, over there, write about the importance of a transformed transgender narrative and call for a critical allyship around trans issues. This should problematize and interrogate theoretical borders, finding strategic points of connection, but allowing for disagreement and contestation. It should also ask itself about the ethics of representation and allow not only for trans voices to lead, but invoking intersectional lens would allow for less privileged trans voices to be heard. It should locate itself squarely in an African context, noting the porousness of the notion of Africanness and the hybridity of indigeneity. Quoting Kaminga 2019, they write, "Transgender transforms as it travels." I think it's a beautiful phrase, very deeply insightful. A reflexive and critical allyship itself will evolve in its journey. Ultimately, it is trans dignity that should prevail. Katrina Mcleod, another author, is here today with their students from Rhodes University. In the development of the Masizi Kobise toolkit for empowerment-focused youth sexuality programs, they emphasize the importance of citizenship. Understandings of citizenship coding tend to advocate for the extension of equal rights to marginalized groups while failing to acknowledge and address oppressive systems that may serve to perpetuate marginalization. Despite claims to universality, the normal citizen remains encoded as male, with the intersection of race, ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and socioeconomic status being just literally glossed over. Sexual citizenship, they argue, serves to collapse that which has been previously thought of as private, i.e. the sexual, and that which is public, the citizen, creating room for a broader understanding of sexual rights and understandings of critical sexual and reproductive citizenship that seeks to expand citizenship to include a broader spectrum of rights and embed these rights within an understanding of social justice. Anthony Brown and his students join us from the University of Johannesburg. In his contribution to the book, Anthony writes about the importance of working with departments of education to transform the school curricula with respect to sexuality and gender. Against a complex and political and cultural background, his chapter describes some of the actions taken by civil society organizations to build alliances with the Ministry of Education in Namibia to ensure the curriculum and teachers respond positively to education about sexual orientation and gender expression in schools. Because both the Ministry of Education and civil society organizations are deeply concerned about the school experiences of young people of diverse genders and sexual orientations, they've worked as partners to create an enabling and safe learning environment. As Anthony writes, the presence of an existing relationship between civil society organizations and the Ministry of Education in Namibia brought familiarity, trust, and openness towards establishing a safe and enabling learning environment for LGBT young people in schools. In particular, and to quote, civil society organizations reviewed the curriculum to examine what is taught about gender and sexuality so as to bring the change within the school environment. They closely examined the life skills curriculum, identified gaps, and made recommendations to promote more affirmative knowledge about sexuality and gender diversity. This event today provides us all with an opportunity to think otherwise and to take the notion of troubling others very seriously. We all need to be troubled, to be challenged, and to see that other ways of interpreting the world are both possible and necessary. I'm certain that the student workshop and discussion by authors that follows will change our scholarship and add immensely to our understanding of pleasure and possibility, sex and sexuality in Southern Africa. In the words of Sylvia Tamale, who I quoted earlier, I hope this day proves to be an incredibly enriching and joyous experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor. It's just amazing that this event has brought together some of the biggest and leading scholars in the field. And so it was great pleasure now that I introduce to you our keynote speaker, Professor Phumla Kola. Professor Kola is the NRF South African Research Chair in African Feminist Imagination at the Nelson Mandela University. Previously, Phumla was a professor of African literature at Wits University, and she's also been a senior lecturer in the Department of English and Classical Culture at the University of Free State, a chief research specialist in society, culture, and identities at the HSRC. Phumla is a graduate of the Universities of Cape Town, Warwick, UK, and she holds a PhD in post-colonial studies from the University of Munich in Germany. Her 7 books include the edited Miriam Tlali, Writing Freedom, on the pioneering Black feminist author, the landmark study, What is Slavery to Me? Post-Colonial Slavery Memory in Post-Apartheid South Africa, published by Wits University Press, the 2016 Sunday Times Alan Payton Nonfiction Award winner, Rape, a South African Nightmare, and Female Fear Factory, which won the Humanities and Social Sciences Nonfiction Award from the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. And with that, I would really warmly welcome our keynote for this afternoon. Welcome, Pumla.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is so good to be here. Sorry, let me just get to the beginning. It's so good to be here at Troubling Others, thinking otherwise, on this remarkably named campus at the University of Pretoria. Some of you know I'm a literary scholar by training, so I delight in the worlds created by the imagination. So this remarkably named campus at the University of Pretoria. I want to say a little bit about that in a minute. And to see old colleagues and friends, VC, Professor Kupe, Dean of Humanities, Professor Reddy, and Professor Divya Bana, in the flesh again, after what feels like an eternity, exacerbated by COVID. Part of it is because of other things, but which then kind of got extended. I also, of course, want to congratulate Professors Mary Crew and Divya Bana and the chapter authors. I haven't read the book, but I am positively, metaphorically, on the edge of my seat. I can't wait to and of course, listening to Professor Cooper speak about it just kind of made me a little jealous that I hadn't, had a chance to look through it. So I look forward to it. It's just congratulations then to the editors and the chapter authors on the publication of Sex, Sexuality, and Sexual Health, which sounds like such an important and exciting contribution to the study of sexuality, gender, and sexual health in our context and in across the world, which is what we're really celebrating today. I'm looking forward to also hearing more about this book and then later, of course, reading it. So I was very excited to see that this campus is called Future Africa Campus. And as I was being driven in, as I was taking in my Uber onto the campus, I was also delighted to see that there's an experimental farm. So I thought, my goodness, of course I'd come up with the title for my talk without knowing that it was going to be specifically at Africa, at Future Africa, and I didn't know about the experimental farm. So I'm quite tickled that in part I wanted to talk about futures, and I wanted to talk about them as forms of experimentation. So it seems rather serendipitous that all of these are happening. So my presentation is called Difficult Pleasures, Recent Experiments in Southern African Feminist Imagination. It is a work in progress. Some of the ideas are still in development. So I'm still wrestling with some of them as part of a larger project of mapping, analyzing, and understanding some of what I see as emergent creative feminist registers, strategies, and thematic recurrences in the context of Southern Africa. It may well be larger than Southern Africa, but that's where I am at the moment in terms of the material that I'm looking at. And of course, I'm physically in Southern Africa. I'm interested in the ways in which such strategies, an emergent, sometimes bubbling up to the surface, at times volcanic eruptions, and in other instances, still as explosions. Imagine ways of thinking about gender, about bodies, about traditions of thinking about gender and sexuality differently. I call them experiments to highlight the sense of dynamism within this space, the testing out, the trying out, the pushing against conceptual, epistemic, and boundaries of genre, as well as the clear attempt to shift understandings of cause and consequences of specific gendered and sexual representational, cartographic, and symbolic decisions. In treatments in this body of work that I'll be looking at, the larger bodies of work from which I extract what I'll present today, and the treatment of boundaries of nation, of literature, of visual art, of film, as porous in the larger project. Today I'll be speaking within a specific genre of poetry. As I thought about how to present some of these ideas, which are still in formation, and what I'm trying to map, what I'm trying to argue is an emergent kind of way of thinking about traditions of gendering, and in some of the kind of feminist creative production. I just decided that I would today uncharacteristically stick to one genre, which is poetry. Part of it is because I wanted to share some of the material with you, and I thought it would be too onerous to try to show you clips from a film, a section from a novel, and so today I will stick with a specific genre, poetry. This is also the other reason why I'm happy that Nokuthula, that I made certain choices, because Nokuthula is here, because in fact her latest novel is part of what I say is part of the material I'm looking at in terms of kind of imagining futures. Difficult pleasures, as I use it here, refers to the insistence on claiming the right to pleasurable, imaginative experimentation in a context of often violent, symbolic, and material overdetermination of women, and specifically Black women, as predictable, one-dimensional, and knowable. These are the traditions we know well, so I won't, for the people in this room, go into what those traditions are, because I might do so in a different context, but I think here it would just be repeating what we all know. These are traditions we know well, authorized by violent hierarchies in our pasts and by their ongoing afterlives. Deeply attentive to the scripting of women's impossibilities and possibilities in various structures of meaning, the feminist imaginative claim to difficult pleasures is a historically attendant orientation, tending to historical definitional technologies as stubbornly as it charts counterintuitive futures, the kind of counterintuitive futures that I think, from the little that I've heard of this book that we're launching today, are part of the larger project that the volume, Sex, Sexuality, and Sexual Health in Southern Africa, also expands and inaugurates and makes possible. Boyce Davis writes of the simultaneity of the importance of simultaneously paying attention to textual and contextual criticism this way. Textual in the close reading of texts, using the literary establishment's critical tools, and contextual as it relates that analyzing a text as it realizes that analyzing a text without some consideration of the world with which it has a material relationship, not just a descriptive relationship, is important. In the juxtaposition of difficult and pleasure, I am also pushing up against another series of inherited traditions within the study of creative genres and the study of Black women's creative production in Southern Africa specifically. I'm deeply dissatisfied with characterizations of such bodies of work, in the main, of work merely in terms of their reactive properties, as protest, as response, as reaction, as writing back, as transgression. In other words, readings which, although not inaccurate, nonetheless occlude other, arguably more dynamic processes at play. While some of the strategies no doubt can be glimpsed in the worlds beyond the creative, the self-consciously, the explicitly creative, which is to say in the world or in the realm of people's concrete historical experiences and negotiations. To study them in this way surfaces, in the way that I am doing, surfaces the intervention necessary to produce a work of art, a poem, a song, a film, a novel, a play, a dance, a painting, a photograph, and so on. Difficult pleasures as analytical category shares the conceptual universe that Natalia Mulebadzi defines as the excavation of what she calls wild imperfections, which she spells as wild imperfections with the I am crossed out. A project she names her most recent edited collection after, but which she has written in scholarly form elsewhere, and which she partially explains as, and I'm quoting her, a feminist poetic language wrested from the violence of patriarchy and racism, a language that accounts for the body's trauma and its limitations while reaching beyond for something yet to be formed. End of quote. It is also an attempt to chart differently. She writes wild imperfections in the way that I've told you, so that we may read both wild imperfections and wild perfections. Additionally, we are forced to think about the interactions of gendered wildness, of women's wildness, of sexually marginalized people's wildness, with ideas of perfection in ways that do not dismiss wildness simply, or wild imperfection, wild perfection, simply as contradiction or oxymoron. What does it mean to sit with these generative, troubling, difficult words alongside each other? And what does it mean to do so against a tradition where perfection, requirements of perfection, are quite concrete in the realm of gender identity, of sexual identity, behavior, practice, desire? These feminist poets enter a language in all the attendant meanings, in which here, woman and black woman as symbol and signifier are already over-determined in the many ways that Desiree Lewis's scholarship in particular, other people, but Desiree Lewis's scholarship in particular has repeatedly drawn our attention to the specific historical ways in which black women in Southern Africa has worked symbolically across different spaces in the national, in the legal, and in the realm of the creative. Work which starts with a 1991 essay, Myths of Power, of Motherhood and Power, reflecting on black women in literature, and spans several decades, explored more recently in her 2020 essay, Undoing Hypervisibility. In the latter, the 2020 Undoing Hypervisibility, Lewis asks, what does it mean as a black woman to be both hypervisible and invisible? What does it mean to be both hypervisible and invisible? And she invites us, as she asks this question, to sit with the difficulty in conception, in categorization, that comes with asking a question which in many ways is unaskable, or appears unaskable. Because indeed, the immediate association is to read hypervisible and invisible as notions, as schema that cannot coexist in the same moment, at the same time, on the same plane. And so what does it mean to think about what appear to be contradictory, mutually exclusive ways of seeing, of interpreting, of reading, of thinking, of feeling, of relating, and to hold both simultaneously, and then to trouble them? To hold them before proceeding to assert and importantly demonstrate in that essay the importance of identifying, and I'm quoting her here, the political and epistemological anchors that have enabled her, she says enabled her to reimagine an assertive sense of self and to carve out a position from which to look and produce critical knowledge. What does it mean to be constructed, to enter a room in which your presence is already predetermined through hypervisibility and invisibility, and to do so and to interact with that space in ways that chooses anchors that allow you to do this kind of work, that allow you to carve out and to reimagine an assertive sense of self that isn't beholden to hypervisibilization and invisibilization, and to also carve out a position from which to look, not only to be looked at, from which to look, from which to assert a specific way, orientation, choice to view and produce critical knowledge. What does it mean to be so defined, to have these traditions enter the room ahead of you, and to nonetheless be able to claim a self, to assert an imagined sense of self that allows, that inculcates, that allows the circulation of interpretative and authority, and shift ways of looking, ways of seeing. The difficult pleasures are produced in such a space, in such a place of, in some ways, indeterminacy, are produced in this space where specific anchors are identified, crafted, and rendered malleable to the feminist imaginative project at hand, an imaginative space that is always more than responsive, but one that is also pleasurable and unapologetically pleasurable in a variety of generative ways, and also in the ways that Barbara Boswell, too, repeatedly reminds us about the project of feminist art making, and specifically writing, the importance of asserting the pleasure of creation, the pleasure in the process of imagining, of play, of experimentation. For Boswell, occupying the space of feminist imaginative experimentation is not escapist. It is not to go to a place of play, rather than it has to reckon with the ways in which words and associations enter the room of meaning and signification, sometimes ahead of the poem, the novel, the film, the artwork produced by a specific feminist. Equally worth emphasizing, the process of creation in these terms, equally worth emphasizing, the process of creation in these terms I am naming difficult pleasures, is also about the delight of creation, of mapping sometimes strings of possibilities, the yet to be formed of Mulibatsi's formulation already cited. It is also a kind of feminist temporal cartographic project. Drawing on Graham Huggins' work, Gail Fincham reads a contemporary South African text not included in my study, and its uses of cartography, map making, as containing important insights for feminist spatial imaginings. I want to extend Fincham's insights for feminist spatial imaginings to also incorporate feminist temporal imaginings in my reading here. Fincham writes, and I quote her, long associated with surveillance and control, cartography has recently come to take on new significance for post-colonial theory. She's writing this in 2014. Since writers may project spaces other than or position themselves in the spaces between those endorsed by dominant cultures. End of quote. Running with Fincham here, I want to suggest that what she calls projecting spaces other than this space is feminist literary cartography, is an ingredient of difficult pleasures. Fincham suggests a reading of feminist cartography as a central part of developing what she calls a language free of phallogocentrism. Adding, MAPS, post-colonial theory, tells us, I know post-colonial theory is unfashionable because this is a time of decoloniality, but I'm a post-colonialist, and so. MAPS, post-colonial theory, tells us, must not be understood in naively realistic terms. What is important is less their relation to a reality outside a perceiver than their reflection of that person's experience. End of quote. Or I would add, the world-making project engaged in creation. I want to pay attention to the specific poetic expression in the work of a select number of Southern African feminist poets. I'll limit it to 4 for the analysis here. In the larger project from which this paper is drawn, difficult pleasures do not inhere in poetic form, but are also explored, theorized through the productive battles with language and the generation of imaginations capacious enough to craft new traditions and ways of moving again through time. Today, I will pay attention to a selection of poems, one each, by South African poets Lebogang Mashile, Natalia Molebatsi, and Koleka Putuma. I think I've dropped the Putuma. Motswana poem Jawang Wadema, and Zimbabwean poet Batsirai Chigama, that demonstrate the capacity of literature not only to imagine the ways in which reality has been or might be interpreted, but also to affect the ways in which reality is produced. And so for those of you who are not necessarily interested in specifically the study of literature, you can start to, I think everything that I have to say is also possibly applicable to just the realm of the imagination. So you can supplement whatever your site of imagination for literature if the literature part is too disruptive. But don't zone me out completely. Each one is concerned with how to write and imagine a language of survival through, during, after the landmine of patriarchal and colonial gender and sexuality. For the speaker in Molebatsi's poem, A Kind of Storm, I'm going to read it because it's very short. Where is it? It's also in here. Some of them are not in here, which is why they dropped out. So it's a very short poem. A kind of storm. I loved a man once who brewed a hurricane inside my throat. I fed him my world. He swallowed me, my dreams, to make his own. I don't blame him. The don't is crossed out. For the mess of survival is crossed out. There's a poem that's difficult to even read because to read out loud, right? To read out loud because it requires it's a poem that both sits and floats on the page. On the one hand, it's transcribed in this way where the lines seem to float on the page. On the other hand, typographically, it presents quite a challenge. For the speaker in Molebatsi's poem, A Kind of Storm, there's hesitation on whether to blame a former lover or not. I blame him. I don't blame him. The poem is visually scattered on the page so that the lines appear to float. Uncertainty over decisions to represent internal flux and perhaps anxiety on matters of forgiveness are represented through the crossed out words on the page, but that are crossed out words on the page that the poet decides not to omit altogether, as we see in the crossing out of "I don't blame him," which suggests both readings of "I blame him" and "I don't blame him" for the mess, and for the mess of survival crossed out. In a much longer poem, I'll come back to this. In a much longer poem, Vulva, Volcanoes, Lebogang Mashile writes of women's hearts as made from vulva tissue. As a speaker lists the attributes of sensory and physical resilience characteristic of such tissue. I will not be reading this one in total because it's 2.5 pages long. But I do recommend it. It is quite a challenging poem. The connection between the heart and women's genitalia fuses two kinds of worlds, the sexual and the emotional, in ways that disrupt what can be spoken. The vulva tissue in this poem ennobles heart structure with more than interiority, but with the conceptual resilience and mnemonic agency. Indeed, as Mashile writes, both vulva in the poem and woman's heart are spheres of named and mythologized presence. To have a vulva tissued heart here is to have an organ made, in the words of the poem, of the indestructible substance of Mashile's first line. Physically and symbolically, such a heart is able to adapt, and here I will read some of the lines, adapt to bleeding, stretching, contracting, connecting, fertile, infertile, birthing, dying with each orgasm, lost lover and unborn child. Life hands us these hearts without insurance. At the heart of owning property is owning women. And what is interesting, of course, about these lines is that there are no breaks. And so we are encouraged in many ways to read the lines as they run into each other, even though, so through the poet's kind of eschewal of guides to how we are to read some of the lines. The poem is also a slow simmering rage in the voice of those declared in the epigraph as, quote, the daughters of the witches they couldn't burn. It reaches backwards to an imaginative pre-patriarchal time when women's vulvas, hearts, and creative energies were unleashed, wild. Eons before the current mythologization of helplessness and excess, where, to quote from lines 23 to 24, respectability and forgiveness are concepts sold to niggers and women. A refusal of stoicism and martyrdom, since, quoting her again, they'll build a shrine to your pain, then say they did it in your name. It is a poem of anger, but like Mona El-Tahawi's anger in her critically acclaimed book, Seven Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, it is an enabling anger. It is a freeing anger. It is not only a legitimated anger. It is also that destroys what is oppressive. It is also an anger that opens up to possibilities yet to be imagined. It is a poem of anger that rejects the conditional entry into importance, history, and valuation offered to women. An unforgiving poem, one of explosive volcanic vulvas and vulva hearts. Yet, Mashile must be aware that although feminist fury is energizing, as Marcus has reminded us elsewhere, an angry artist is a polemicist. Her writing is judged in a special category, as if writing inspired by anger were not worthy of the name of art. And so to speak about, to write in these ways through the gesture, through the articulation of an enabling and an inaugurating anger is always also to enter the terrain of dismissal of artistry when writing as angry, when claiming the anger. The artist, Mashile herself, is not outside of these concentric circles of definition explored by the speaker in her poem, but deeply implicated and read through them, even as she attempts to unwrite them in her poem. In this poem, Mashile's speaker centers the experiences of women in various rhetorical gestures. Both the speaker whose anger is expressed on behalf of the daughters of defiant women who have been under assault for being illegible, wild, and unuseful to patriarchy. The speaker speaks for a we that is omnipotent, not just in one historical era, but across epochs and large expanses geographically. In other words, she speaks to tradition and traditions of making sense of women's wildness. And yet in her poem, it is an authoritative, the speaking from this position of anger, it's an authoritative we, whose language is unapologetic and sexually explicit, using the languages of women's bodies to speak on behalf of themselves against patriarchal mythologization, echoing and referencing across time both to the witch trials of Salem, but also contemporary witch burnings in Southern Africa and other parts of the world. The large-scale femicidal impulse inherited is refused success and completion as the mothers of the women the speaker represents escaped the targeted homicidal erasure. They are difficult to erase. They return again and again and again. They are dangerous women, the dangerous daughters of dangerous mothers, whose memory is as disruptive to patriarchy as is their will and claim to power in the present and the futures in the making. Refusing all of the options offered by patriarchy, the speaker, representing the collective, the speaker in the poem speaks always as a we, also addresses a you, identified as woman, a you, second person pronoun, deployed throughout the poem. In other words, the poem is from one group of women to another individual or group, symbolically, of women. The warnings stretch from historical record to predictions of contemporary seductions in the narration of national memory. Rather than forgive or the other litany of patriarchal possessions on offer masked as choices, the speaker advises in the second last line of the poem that the you, quote, rather go mad. Mad here is used as synonym for anger, and this reading is useful. But mad also points to the ways in which women are dismissed as outside of rational patriarchy, and the expressions of the kind of sexual and gendered freedoms explored in this poem, the wildness of a time imagined both in the future in a post-patriarchal imagined future that this that the poem imagines, but also in the backward glance of an imagined, longed-for pre-patriarchal future. In other words, the invitation is to claim that which patriarchy demonizes, madness as anger and madness as wildness. Because therein lies women's power in the poem and explanation for its marginalization and violent attempts at its erasure across time. Some of this definition lies in anger as empowering as well as delightful and as inaugurating, as Audre Lorde reminds us, for women raised to fear. Too often, and I'm quoting Lorde, for women raised to fear, too often anger threatens annihilation. In the male construct of brute force, we were taught that our lives depended upon the goodwill of patriarchal power. The anger of others was to be avoided at all costs because there was nothing to be learned from it but pain. A judgment that we had all been bad girls, come up lacking, not done what we were supposed to do. And if we accept our powerlessness, then of course any anger can destroy us. End of Lord. Mashile, with Lord, invites us to think about what anger does when the we in the poem and its representatives, do not accept our powerlessness, but imagine differently. What does anger do then? What is the place of anger then in the imaginative project? Kathleen Fisher writes, we often fear that anger is the antithesis of love. But it is actually an intrinsic, although difficult, dimension of loving well. And it's interesting that in these poems, anger and love, anger often is the pathway to learning to love the self, or in Desiree Lewis's terms, to come to a language of asserting a self. An intrinsic, though difficult, dimension of loving well. A world that generates anger and constricts its expression is one that limits loving well and loving self. In Tawa Dema's Plow. So, okay, maybe then I won't read the poem. I'll just speak to it. In Chawangwa Dema's Plow, my apologies, the poem begins by evoking the spheres of myth that use women's bodies to speak about imperial contestation over land, as well as the intersections with patriarchal, lauded symbols of motherhood, rendering instead visible both the isolation and shared heavy labor that comes with rearing practices. It is a poem named for a labor process rendered myth, but here focalized differently through experience, through a questioning gaze, through an unmaking and writing and unwriting of many received notions of a celebrated motherhood, or even of a collective, of a much mythologized African village rearing solution, where Dema instead insists, so we see the women in the fields singing about their isolation in the process of mothering. Now, of course, this is a disruptive rendering of mothering and motherhood in a context where motherhood is often spoken about in that kind of metaphoric, much mythologized notion of the African village raising a child. And so there's this kind of juxtaposition, I'm summarizing, juxtaposition of the traditions which speak of collective mothering, of romantic mothering, of natural mothering, of the world of instinct, with the experience which is belabored, which is uncertain, which is hesitant, and which for several of the mothering figures in the poem is an isolated, difficult experience. Inviting us here to focalize through an experience that is questioning, an unsettling experience, a troubling, one that rejects the mere use of the reduction of women to metaphor. It is one that, like Lewis's invitation, invites a different seeing. I'm going to read the last 4 lines. So the last 4 lines: we heard ourselves for what we had always been, we who are a chorus left to turn the soil over with spit for rain, to labor and make life between the hard places. A call to a seeing differently. The we in the poem, unidentified, but deduced as more and more positions and information, is uncovered. A we that calls for a different focalization and a hearing self that processes information radically at odds with the inherited traditions. And a hearing, of course, and the importance of hearing emphasized through the repetition of the chorus from a song. I'm going to skip Chigama and then just go to the very, very end. Difficult pleasures, then, are an engagement and a decision to engage with generational impetus, a refusal to defer to traditions, a questioning of both memory and amnesia. In his introduction and his welcoming, Tawana Kupe spoke about the importance of not defending the old. And that kind of rhymed, that resonated so much when I was thinking about the poems I've read today and the larger project that I'm trying to map. So a questioning, not a refusal to defer to traditions, regardless of where these traditions come from, when these are traditions that are onerous, that are burdensome, that are hierarchical, that are violent, that mythologize pleasure while making pleasure impossible. Resisting defending the old, problematizing the old, spotlighting the importance of learning. The poem that I omitted has a line where there's a celebration of figures that fail, that try to learn how to breathe, and they fail, and they try again, and they fail, and they try again. And there's an apology by the speaker for the lack of an inherited tradition that allows them to breathe and live and soar. It seems to play in the realm of difficult pleasures, then, is to rise to the invitation of embracing, not just embracing the new, but imagining and inaugurating the new and expanding what is not yet. It is rise to the invitation to courageously confront even the anxieties that Vasu Reddy referred to in his opening, to engage with how to create different kinds of questions and futures in place of existing structures and stories. And so I think that this project that I'm trying to map is perhaps a cousin project of the book that we will be talking about in more detail today. This troubling of others, this thinking differently, not avoiding difficulty, but failing and falling, but learning how to breathe and creating traditions of how to breathe. Deliberate in the pursuit of a differently gendered and sexually shaped and accented world. I'm going to stop there.
I'm really left breathless. I began with the theme about sexuality and the fact that sexuality is indeed the air that we breathe. And Pumla, you've showed us how difficult it is to breathe, but you end exactly where I was about to begin in this next part of the event, is that there are indeed spaces that are available for us to expand the possibilities for imagining new ways of being. I really, from the bottom of my heart, want to thank you for that splendid keynote. Thank you. At this point in the program, I want to briefly introduce to you the main themes of the book. It has already been illustrated, so I would try to be very specific about some of the main points that I think need to be illustrated here. But before I do that, I really want to say thank you to Mary and to Peter. Without Mary and Peter, this event was not possible. And I've said this before, but I want to repeat this. There are such big minds in this room today, and that you and combined, we are developing new ways of thinking. Pumla, you were talking about, this is a literature field and scholarship, but I have to say how those, the vocabulary around how you framed difficult pleasures can be such an important resource in us thinking differently. So thank you very much. We cannot be silent. We cannot think. We no longer can have silos in how we think sexually. And I think that is one of the key aims of the book. We have brought together a range of scholars from different fields, from different areas of interest, but whose point of departure is that sexuality and sexual health cannot be considered unless sexual justice underpins the work towards sexual health. So that is the punchline of the book. We argue for expanded possibilities in thinking about sexuality. We are frustrated with the enduring position of women and girls, the enduring ways in which women are used as human scratching poles. We are tired of sexuality being framed in that way. We are also frustrated that sexuality and masculinity have been configured in ways that have homogeneously positioned men in Southern Africa and in South Africa as uninterruptedly horrible, bad, violent. And this book tries to address that. Kopano Rotela's chapter talks about what does it mean when we talk about love and boys and masculinity. And so the notion that, that sexuality is the air that we breathe, but why is it that some of us are left gasping for breath? Why is it that there continues to be the erasure of trans, for instance, the marginalization despite policy and despite the country's progressive outlook towards diversity? And so the themes in the book address this. Number one, the issue around sexual diversity. Number two, the issue around a broader comprehension of sexuality, the difficult pleasures, but also the pleasurable desires. And how might that be possible? The next theme is around sexual justice and sexuality. The whole, the country and its focus on activism, and that's a very important area to consider. And of course, one of the themes that we cannot get rid of. I can imagine 100 years from now whether we might still have gender and sexual violence on our radar when we do work around sexualities. What might sexualities research look like in Southern Africa in 100 years' time? And so we are really frustrated that violence remains an epidemic, that this country has been described as a country at war when it concerns gender and sexual violence. And so these competing, these contradictory themes, love, violence, sex, diversity, are all part of this book. But they present to us just one version. And what this book also invites us to do is to think beyond, is to inspire us to develop new agendas, as you have put it today, Pumla, to develop new agendas in thinking about the place of men, women, boys and girls, genders and sexualities broadly conceived. And so in this expanded possibility, what might it look like? How can we imagine being different, thinking different? What might be thinkable? And these are important questions which Pumla, you've addressed so remarkably in terms of presenting us with different sorts of literature. But I also want to end the way Pumla did, to expand our possibilities. How we are not where we are ceasing to be where we are. 30 years ago, when sexuality research emerged in terms of its relationship with HIV, we are ceasing to be where we were at or where we are. But we are not yet where we need to be. And it is in this space between ceasing to be where we are or where we were and imagining where we want to be is that sort of dynamic presence that I see, and the hope and the possibilities and the affirmative ways in which we can take our research forward. So that is, in a sense, the book. And I now leave it to the authors to describe more in depth in terms of their specific chapters. So I call upon the authors of the, beginning with Anthony, coming here to the lectern. Please, the authors, and Pierre, are you going to be moderating this? So Anthony, Pierre, Katrina, blessings and nirvana. So in this part of the program, we have a few of the authors present here. And again, I want to say how grateful we are that you have indeed made time to be present at the event. And I would like to begin. And so basically, the authors would talk about their specific chapters, highlighting and giving more depth to the sort of themes that we have highlighted thus far. And I'd like to begin with Anthony and his chapter on civil society organization in Namibia. So over to you, Anthony.
Thank you so much, Divya, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for this great opportunity to share a little bit about my chapter. It is about civil society organizations and their drive in creating a socially just environment in the discourse and education of sexual and gender diversity education. I want to talk about a country, Namibia, that you have heard very little about in terms of sexual and gender diversity. What you do know about Namibia, that it was a fifth province during the apartheid years in South Africa. It was a former German colony, and after the Second World War, this country, remember it's a country, not a province, was then given to South Africa to support them towards self-administration. And South Africa decided, the apartheid government at the time, to take it in as their own and exploit the resources and its people. And there was a huge a fight with the colonial masters. And this fight was conducted with various agencies. It included the liberation strugglers, the SWAPO party at the time. It included civil society organizations. It included the church towards social justice. And so the understanding of social justice for sexual and gender diversity, it's the same fight that we had for democracy back in the days of apartheid. And what I am trying to advocate is that we cannot look at a single agency to fight for social justice in terms of sexual and gender diversity. And I'm particularly looking at the school context because school is a highly contested space. Divya has written, I've learned many years back, that children are seen as sexually innocent beings. Your sexuality starts in adulthood. But we know, as Divya said, we are sexual beings from day one. And our children suffer for 12 years and more in schools because their sexuality are oppressed and made invisible. And so we're going to look at how civil society has contributed to make sure that there's social justice for the agency and learning of these young people in the Namibian school context. Next slide, please. So sexuality is political, it's cultural, it's social. But I want to start off as I said, Namibia was a colony of Germany, and then later on the province to South Africa. And we inherited all of these colonial laws, including the sodomy law. And to date, the sodomy law is still upheld in the Namibian context. And it is interpreted that same-sex or sexual diversity is illegal in Namibia, but we know the sodomy law talks about same-sex practices between two males, and it doesn't include the diversity of experiences between human beings. Ironically, this country is very interesting. When we look at the sodomy law that's still on the Namibian legal books, there's a moratorium on the sodomy law. So why having this law on the books? But this law then is interpreted that sexual and gender diversity is illegal. And when the ones who are not in favor of it speak about it, it creates social dissonance. But Namibia is a very interesting country for those who have traveled there. You will find that people with diverse sexual orientations and gender expressions are free. They express themselves, they are in partnerships, they get married here in South Africa and carry on with their lives there in Namibia. And so it's a very complex understanding of this. However, when they are faced with issues of safety, the police are not there to support them. When they have health issues, then health officials will not support them. However, the patient charter in Namibia said there will be no discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. However, because of the social dissonance, there's still a lack of care and support in certain services. Next slide. So on the next slide, if they manage to do that, I want to slightly speak about the educational landscape. We have a number of educational policies and acts in the country, in Namibia. And we find that all of the laws and policies prohibit, oh yeah. Yeah, future Africa. We still want to go manual. Hi, Prof. This is a rough one, too rough. Yeah, and they tell you here on the screen. Let me not waste my time. But anyway, so we have these laws, and these laws speak to the prohibits all forms of discrimination in the country, all forms of discrimination. But it does not speak particularly to sexual and gender diversity. And because there's no reference to sexual and gender diversity in most of the policies, it is regarded that those discriminations are not applicable to sexual and gender diversity identities. Inclusive education also creates a safe and enabling environment for diverse identities, and they list them in the inclusive education policy. However, sexual and gender identity is not mentioned. Interestingly, Namibia is the first African country, believe me, Divya, since 2000, had sexual and gender diversity in the life skills curriculum. However, it said sexual and gender, it would say we should respect homosexuals. Now, that's a very interesting term there, because Namibia identifies at 90% Christian. And we know how the Bible uses the term homosexuality as a sin, as carnal, as and in social spaces and political spaces, it's regarded as un-African. And so this term homosexual has been very problematic in the curriculum. It also calls, although it calls for the respect for homosexuals, but at that time, the mere mentioning that there's a call for respect showed that there was some movement and traction in creating a safe and enabling environment in Namibia, where most of the other African countries would not even mention it. However, there was a silence on transgender identities at the time. And one of the statements in the curriculum would say, homosexuals should know their place in society. Now, I don't know what place was that. And we asked, where is this place? What is this place? What did it entail? And it was very clear that those who developed these curriculum statements were not very clear of what they were talking about, as long as there's some reference that sounded right on their ear. And sexual and gender diversity was framed as a choice. You know, it's a preference. People with homosexual preferences, that was the statement in the curriculum. So the moment when it's a preference, it can be changed. And one of the words, for example, the local languages, Prof, is that if you refer to a person with non-heterosexual identities in Damara, has a lot of clicks, almost like the Xhosa people, is kama. And the word kama is an object that is bended. And any object that is bended needs straightening. And often when you need to straighten it, it requires force. And so we could see if this was a preference that was not acceptable in society, we had to straighten you. We had to use force to get you in an ideal structure or form. And lack of guidelines to support learners with diverse sexual orientations, although there was this idea that we need to be embracing. I got it. And so, as I said, social justice in Namibia cannot be achieved without considering the multiple agencies that have contributed towards democracy, equality, equity in Namibia, access, and democratic participation. And I wanted to zoom in a little bit on queer civil society, because in the early 90s, the first president, and some of you were probably too young, but some of my colleagues on this side of the room will remember, our first president in Namibia was Sam Nujoma. And Sam Nujoma in 1993 already said, we're going to export them all to Europe because sexual and gender diversity is a new colonialism form. And civil society, who just started regrouping at that time, started to confront the president already in the 1993 era. At that time, a lot of we had what we call a special police force. If men were found with earrings in their ears, the special police force would come and rip it out because you were perceived as homosexual. If you dressed in a particular way, your clothes would have been ripped off because you want to be a woman. And so civil society started to speak out against these forms of violence already in 1994, 1993. In the 2000s, we had a new president who called, Ifikipunye Pohamba, and he called for a Namibia that is one. They had a slogan in Swapo, one Namibia, one nation. And the second president of Namibia said, if we are to have one nation, everybody should be respected and regarded in this country. That was the open door, and civil society started conversation with the president's office at the time, with school communities. It was also in 1996, after the Salamanca Conference of Inclusive Education, that civil society said, well, inclusivity should include people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. They knocked on the door of the Ministry of Education, and they said, listen, we don't want to fight with you because civil society has always been seen as people who fight, people who are reactionary, people who are angry. And they entered through the inclusive education policy door to say, let us tell you what we experienced when we were at school. let us tell you what we are going through currently. And if you are advocating for an inclusive, safe, and enabling learning environment, you will have to consider all learners, regardless of background and sexuality. And so we had a roundtable discussion in 2017 with civil society in Namibia with the same approach to say we come in with the same interest that you have, the interest on the well-being of learners, to be safe, to be well, and to have an enabling learning environment. The ministry agreed to join this roundtable. They analyzed the school curriculum and found those statements that were not very transformative and enabling. And it was actually at a very interesting time when the department or the Ministry of Education had curriculum reform. And it's during this curriculum reform that we had the roundtable. And the ministry said, if you have so much evidence that what we do is harmful, please help us to reform the curriculum. They were given carte blanche. This is the curriculum, we are reforming it. Tell us what we should do. And the civil society was treated as people who come in with expertise, with lived experiences, and have knowledge. Some of them were educated within this field. And they were regarded as partners. And currently in Namibia, civil society work as partners in health, in the legal frameworks, in the Office of the Presidency, to make sure that we have a socially just environment. When they were given this opportunity, they inserted those statements. And you can see there, the second one, discuss the human rights for diverse sexual orientations and gender identity. So in Namibia, sexual and gender diversities in the school context should be approached from a human rights perspective. So already at two levels, you can see that civil society are making inroads at the school level, but also at the human rights or a legal framework. Another thing that was very important for me there is discuss how to establish social cohesion among people with different sexual orientations, because often there's so much focus on the rights of those with diverse sexual orientations. We don't look at how can we live alongside one another despite our differences. And so teachers are supposed to teach this in the school. Currently, teachers are working on an addendum of the textbook so that these curriculum statements are then facilitated. And then also now in September, these civil society organizations will work with teachers to bring an awareness in the classroom, or give them, equip them to deal with issues of sexual and gender diversity in the classroom. This is very progressive for a country who wanted to deport people with diverse sexual orientations to embracing them. But this started with a partnership with civil society. It takes a village to raise a child. We have to consider the multiple agencies that can contribute to social justice in and around the school environment. I do want to say, if we believe education by itself can bring about social justice in the education of sexual and gender diversity, we are the believers of the impossible, for it takes a village to raise a child. Thank you.
I'm sad that I have to go after you. It's hard to be as dynamic and exciting and interesting. I'd like to thank my co-author of this chapter, Christy Kruger. Without her, it really wouldn't have happened. In some ways, our chapter, I think, is a little bit of an outlier because we don't really talk about sexuality or sexual health at all. Rather, what we focus on is, in a sense, the politics of naming and organizing in the trans space and the role of allyship. And we decided in writing the chapter to invoke a kind of geographic metaphor. So there's a bit of synchronicity, Prof. Pumla, when you talked about the cartography and feminist spatial imaginings. And we use the idea of borders and crossing borders in thinking about who gets to define trans politics, who speaks for trans people, how do trans organizations work with other queer organizations, do LGB-focused organizations, how do they conceive of themselves as allies with trans activists and trans people? And also, how do we identify and think about trans identities in a context where much of the naming systems have come from northern theories and activisms? So when I was thinking about this presentation today, I decided to Google some ideas around geography and mapping. And I discovered that there was a dispute around who actually discovered the North Pole between Peary and Cook. And the discovery was symbolized by the planting of a flag. And it made me think about the idea of the politics of discovery. Because, of course, the North Pole existed before that flag was planted. And for those white men, perhaps privileged white men, found the North Pole. So I think it's a useful idea to think about how do we discover? What are the politics of discovery? Whose voices in that discovery matter? And today's brief reflection is very much about voice. And I've invited a trans activist, academic and writer to speak for trans issues and trans people rather than myself. And in our process of coming to an agreement of sorts of what we would talk about today, we saw it as an iterative process of question and answer. And in some of the thoughts or questions that I had come to mind when sharing with Lunda, I was thinking about how trans politics and identities and issues have become weaponized globally, and that trans people and trans identities are being used by politicians and people in power to further a particular agenda. And some of those questions were along the lines of who delineates the terrain, who defines, who speaks for. And we've seen much contestation around defining the category woman, for example, with essentialist ideas emerging. Who gets to define what kind of political and moral order we see as right and proper for society? And we've seen globally how trans people are positioned in ways that make them anti the moralism project. How do trans people, trans activists engage with, relate to, express themselves as feminists in a time when trans exclusionary radical feminism seeks to position trans people and trans women in particular ways? And then whose voices matter in defining trans questions? And I think a quote that I'd like to end off with before inviting Lunda to share his views is from Shuffle's papers. Someone called Hannah Lee Johnson, who reflected on something called an ethic of responsible listening, which she explains as the process of opening up discursive spaces for trans voices to be heard and responded to. In tandem with listening, she says, goes ally labor, a category of complex practices without guarantee that seek to benefit trans lives through a process of cis people leveraging their privilege to enable trans people to better navigate systems of oppression. So Lunda, over to you.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Pierre. My name is Lunda Mabenge. I'm very young in this academic space, first year PhD at UCT. I cannot speak for trans identities. I myself am a trans man, a black transgender man. But I can try and speak to some of those issues because I carry my own intersecting struggles. And I think a lot of what you speak to, Pierre, is rooted in power, who carries the power. Where is that power located? And I think in a lot of scholarship, we speak to intersectionality, and rightfully so, and we neglect the matrix of domination. And I think that's equally as important, because it sets the terrain in terms of how we explore who actually ultimately holds that power. And when we look at allyship, if we look at society, we look at the home. The home is a microcosm of society, right? And that's where allyship should begin. And so no two trans identities will ever be the same. And there's also the issue of access to language, accessible language. And on the one hand, we do need to sort of forego rooting ourselves in indigenous ways of thought, but not completely so, because what I speak to the biblical and theological normative that came with a specific language that changed the landscape in how we term and frame language, and how we build a lexicon when we want to refer and group people and identify people based solely on their surface anatomy. And I think that becomes a very, very big problem. So even in terms of allyship itself, it's very important to look at where the power is located, how that power is concentrated, but also importantly to negotiate access. So in scholarship, we have what we call reflexivity. And I think that needs to be an iterative process and part of what negotiating access is, to foreground the fullness of a human being and not limit a human being to their surface anatomy, which is how the heteronormative patriarchal structure, as we know it, has come to be defined, because we look at surface anatomy and we make determinations in terms of what people need and what access they need, where, how. Part of my scholarship is actually in the public health space, and even within healthcare access or a lack of access, there is still this rooted focus on how a person's body is constructed just based on their genitals and what type of care they would need based off of that. And that becomes a problem. So there's the need to sort of expand that lexicon, and also to sort of realize that allyship in and of itself is also not homogeneous, right? The needs of trans identities are not homogeneous, and so it becomes important to engage iteratively, to use inclusive and neutral language. I think you and I were speaking about pronouns earlier, and how it's becoming easier and the norm to refer to gender-neutral pronouns and neutral language now than it was 5 or 10 years ago, which is also a sign of progress. And also an avoidance of microaggressions. I think what we also tend to forget is that trans identities themselves, they can, in their journey and quest towards their becoming, embody levels of internalized phobia because of that matrix that says this is how you ought to be, this is how you behave, this is the language that you need to aspire towards. So I think yeah, that makes sense. If that makes sense, am I making sense? So that's the rooting of allyship, and I think for the most part it's a negotiated access. It's not assuming that we would holistically know how to relate to and embody or hold space for people. We need to find ways to engage in those conversations, and especially within such chapters that make it possible to explore and self-interrogate what we need to learn and unlearn as we continue our journeys. I think our 10 minutes is up.
Good afternoon, everyone. All protocols observed. So I'm Blessings, and I'm here with my colleague Nirvana. We are going to move away from all the big people and concede and look at the young people, because sexuality also plays a key role amongst young people, and in particular those that are between the ages of 10 to 24. And that is where this work is mainly based in. So in terms of the current discourses around sexual reproductive health, we look at the dominant perceptions, agendas and protocols and priorities and policies that are mainly focused on women. Gender, patriarchy, as well as attention to vulnerable populations is limited. And there's also rare consideration, in particular, for interpersonal dynamics of sex and reproduction, in particular in Southern Africa. So our aim in our chapter, we basically looked at trying to counter the generalizations and unsettle some of the common assumptions and discourses around sexual reproductive health. We really tried to understand the different contradictions, the silences, as well as the single stories that usually come out, the representation and framing of young people within sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of the unpacking, really, we look at the conceptualization, resisting the ideas of Africa as a hub of hyperfertility, exploring how HIV continuously contributes to the sexual reproductive health agenda. We also discuss the sexual reproductive health unmet needs and explore sexual reproductive health and whose privileges are we really working on or looking at. We also looked at women's biological and reproductive body, in particular how policies, programs, and associated discourses impact and affect sexual reproductive health and services and support for the young people. I know we really acknowledged as colleagues to say, do we have the power to look at the southern region as a whole? But we're really interested in finding out how the SADC sexual reproductive health strategy for 2019 and 2030 and the Maputo Plan of Action really calls upon countries within the southern region to look and integrate all persons in sexual reproductive health related issues. We also consider the variations in economy, the laws, the social values, and everyday life, how these can be impacted by the different and cross-cutting jurisdictions, ethnicities, languages, and also causing the rural and urban divide and inequalities across the region. However, we emphasize that these differences are of key importance within the southern region because they give us the value to do a comparison between countries. They also give us the need for us to locate different lenses that we can be able to understand in depth the different sexual reproductive related issues that affect the 15 countries that are within the southern region. In terms of the methods that we used for this chapter, basically we looked at the field notes that some of the colleagues, Nevana, who is here, Alex, who was working in Uganda, myself as I was working in Malawi, as well as key discussions with our supervisor, Professor Leno, who is in absentia. We looked at the different ethnographies, in particular abortion care in Uganda, the informal settlement in relation to adolescents and young women, pregnant young women in South Africa, 15 to 19-year-olds, young people who were attending a teen club clinic within Malawi. So it was more of a multi-method approach whereby we used the different ethnographies and we linked it to observational studies as well as literature and focus group discussions within the different participants. What were some of the key themes that we looked at? We tried to understand sexual reproductive health, in particular looking at how equitable access and issues to do with capacity, health, as well as relationships across the communities. How men's health is usually not looked at, and we always think that our men in Africa have all that it takes and they don't get sick, which is something that we said in terms of sexual reproductive health. We need to look in depth at where are our men and how best can we work with them. Then we also needed to consider the modern as well as the traditional ways, practices of infertility or fertility control, in particular in relation to child spacing. And then we looked at sexual desires and sexuality as being made more visible within the young people. And among young people and sexual reproductive health, we looked at the unwanted and unintended pregnancies, in particular in relation to gender-based violence, the agency, successful pregnancies and delivery, the single stories that showed in-depth, rich data on how young people are able to accept and work with playful sexual practices, as well as acknowledging that they also have sexual desires as well as pleasure, and that is part of their lives as they grow up. We also looked at HIV prevention, mainly looking at male and female condoms, their low usage and acceptability, multiple prevention technologies as we work with young people who are living with chronic conditions, looking at male and female LGBTQI prevention technologies and their preferences across a time and across the changing times. The idea was there's a mix of technologies that are coming up now, and how in the different contexts within the region of sub-Saharan Africa and in everyday lives of people, how these preferences are continuously changing. And then in terms of sex work, we considered the flexible nature of sex work and how it is compared with the other available options, income-generating options that are available for women. But we also saw how male sex work male sex work among minorities is not really being discussed in depth across the southern region. In terms of our discussion, we looked at how sexual reproductive health and rights is mainly shaped by the HIV pandemic. The pleasure, the differences in terms of diversity, agency, unless if it is linked to vulnerability, it is talked much about, but it is usually obscured within the literature. There's also failure in terms of discussion, of decision-making, autonomy, agency across the full range of sexual reproductive health issues. And then there's this less issues on biopolitical, socioeconomic context of diseases, transmission, institutional and structural violence that keep on coming up over and over again. In a nutshell, there is so much that has been written in terms of overemphasis on ARVs as prevention and PrEP as techno-fixes that deflect attention on HIV as well as ARV, in particular in relation to social and political context, which shapes sexuality and sexual reproductive health and well-being across Southern Africa. More attention is now being paid to the different genders, the masculinities, the femininities, the underrepresented bodies, in particular when they're engaging with sexuality as well as to curb homophobia and transphobia. And this has been really discussed in depth by my colleagues here. There's also medical and social discourses and policies that are surrounding gender and sexuality, contraception, and disease prevention, in particular with non-reproductive as well reproductive bodies, which continue to heighten inequalities in sexual reproductive health. But our main understandings in terms of sexuality is the idea that we need to continue to look at sexuality that continuously is shifting and needs to shift with regards to the rights to pleasure, the right to belonging, as well as resistance and non-heteronormative sexual identity. In a nutshell, the issue is on how best do we work together in order to continuously shift the need to shift in terms of sexual reproductive health in Southern Africa. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Katrina Mcleod. I'm Sachi Chair of Critical Studies in Sexualities and Reproduction at the university, very unfortunately still known as Rhodes. The unit that I head takes a feminist and decolonializing approach to sexualities and reproduction. Very purposefully, the word health doesn't exist in the title. And so what I'm going to present on today is part of our attempt as the unit to take theory and move it into praxis, into policy, into advocacy, into practice. And where that came from, that kind of burning desire to do something more than think clever ideas, comes off the basis of my own frustration of having written about teenage pregnancy for years, deconstructive discourse analysis of teenage pregnancy, even saying, well, I mean, putting those two words together, teenage and pregnancy, already creates a new thing that is problematic. And, years and years of doing that, and I open the newspaper and exactly the same thing is said again. Oh, we've got all these problems. So many people are getting pregnant. It is a disaster. And all the years where we've said, actually, it's about socioeconomic status, it's about disadvantage. What you're seeing there is not about age per se. I won't get onto that topic because I'll take forever, much more than my 10 minutes about that. What we're talking about is the Masizi Kobise toolkit that we're starting to develop. Masizi Kobise meaning let us empower ourselves. And this is an important, that reflexive kind of whip us ourselves is an important part of the toolkit. And as our wonderful keynote speaker said, language matters. And it comes off a basis of so inserting, I suppose, a different language into the biomedical health space, because we know that sexual and reproductive issues continues to be dominated by biomedical issues. And in fact, there's a fairly kind of, we're quite siloed. There are those people who do public health, and then there's us who do the sort of more critical work. And very seldom do they meet in any kind of space. And so this is one of our attempts. We have another one. It's around supportability, the notion of why unintended pregnancies is a problematic word, and so the notion of supportability, which means that you have support, social, but also the individual support. That's a different project. But the Masizi Kobise is one of our attempts to take theory, different theory, we think, and get it into the spaces between people. And they might both fail dismally. We don't know. Or they may be brilliant in the end. Who knows? Okay. But we're going on a journey together, researchers, students, and myself, to try and make these work. So what is this tool? Well, it comes off the basis initially of looking at sexuality education, which has gone through a number of different ways of being. If we look at the history of sexuality education, it really kind of, in a formal sense, okay, that's different from sexual socialization. That happens all the time, okay? So sexuality education is a kind of formalized program of some sort, whether it's in the schools or outside or whatever, has gone through quite an arc. It started off really in the early 1900s with a confluence between the child study movement and the hygiene movement. And the hygiene movement was like they were worried about all these people getting sexually transmitted infections and these wayward people who were, kind of transmitting these things, and they wanted adults to be better. But of course, adults would just go, well, we're just going to do what we're doing anyway, we're not listening to you. But the child study movement, coming off Stanley Hall's idea of adolescence and how you've got to now shape these young people, this new idea of adolescence, which is new, by the way, in the sort of early 1900s. You can now, those two join together. It was a happy partnership, and now we can start actually teaching these young people before they are corrupted, because the adults, they're already corrupted. So the birth of sexuality education was concentrated on health initially. But then there's, of course, later on we get the sort of population control, the whole idea of too many people having, and you start getting contraception as a major issue in sexuality education. We all know, of course, ICPD in 1994, the notion of rights comes in. It's new, it's innovative, it holds a lot of promise. The problem, of course, is that rights then easily slips into responsibilities, into an idea that we have to essentially coerce people into making particular kinds of decisions. And then you get empowerment programs that start to say, okay, but actually what we want to do is we want to empower people to make the right decisions, okay? So empowerment sounds great, except that very often what we found in empowerment programs is that it reduces down into self-efficacy. The social aspects of empowerment are often neglected. So there's the idea of you must take responsibility. There's a confluence now of responsibility and agency. So noting some of the limitations of many of the notions of empowerment, there has been a movement towards the notion of justice. Sexual and reproductive justice has become, in a sense, the new type of thing that rights were in 1994. Now, we argue that justice is fine and ethics of justice is great, but it neglects an ethics of care. And it also is very much a public thing. Okay, so I worked with a colleague and we started to work on a sexual and reproductive citizenship framework. Now, you get into trouble there as well because citizenship is also a complicated notion, and it has been very masculinized, and it has been very much as a kind of thing of status. So we worked with feminist, disability, and queer reworkings of citizenship, and came up with a kind of a framework that tries to take the notion of citizenship but work it into a way that is feminist, that appreciates things like disabilities, queer, and essentially there are key issues within this framework that we say need to be considered. The first one is that status and practice are interlinked. And now I'm going to pause here just to say that status, of course, is possibly the point that we got stuck on, because status means belonging. Okay. Now, normally we know national status, you are either born in a place or you are naturalized into it, but you belong as a citizen in one place but not in another place. So I can't go to Namibia and just say I'm a Namibian. It won't work. But in sexual and reproductive rights are seen by the World Health Organizations, by United Nations, as universal rights. And so sexual and reproductive rights, you belong wherever you are in the world. Okay, so the belonging is important here. But practice and belonging are intertwined. So that's one of the key issues. There's the issue, and I don't want to explain all of them. There's situated agency, the idea that agency is both possible and constrained at the same time. Differentiated universalism, where the category of woman that you spoke about, that trans identity is not identical, but there's differentiation, but there's also, what do we understand as universal? What is the bottom line that we have here? What are the rights that are absolutely fundamental, whatever your identity? So that's a key thing. The interweaving of the public and the private, the cross borders that has been spoken about here. The politics of recognition, so that's about identity, which has to go along with the politics of redistribution. They cannot be separated, and of reparation where there has been damage. So those are the sort of theoretical frameworks. What we've done now, we've tried to take that and put it into something that is usable, where we ask questions of youth empowerment programs to say, using this framework, how are you doing? Are these things being brought into this program? We've started off with an initial one. So the Masizixobise toolkit is meant as both an evaluation tool and as a design tool. So we've started off with the evaluation part with a manual of it's specifically a youth empowerment sexualities program. And it has been so interesting to use this toolkit as a lens through which to see this program. And what you see is absolutely, they talk about rights, yes, indeed. But it's at the end, and it's a little chapter, all on its own. Okay, so rights are there. But in the rest, so you get to, okay, so start off with the biology. The biology is, here's the woman's body, here's the man's body. Okay, really problematic, okay? So those are, this is now where we start coming down to brass tacks. Take the theory, it's over there. We want to take it down to brass tacks and say, okay, how can we use this to make a difference in the manuals that learners read, are exposed to, etc. The next thing that we're going to be doing, and Matsepo, who is in the audience there, is one of the people who's working on it, we're going to try to design now, it's fairly, okay, we'll try, we'd want to design an in-service training program for frontline workers. So that's why I say, in the space. So for community health workers, for nurses and nurse assistants, for social workers and social work assistants, using this tool and saying, okay, how do we then translate this into an in-service training for people who are going to be interacting with others about sexualities and reproduction? Can this be used to make some kind of difference in that space, and not just a kind of biomedical, we know that a whole load of things happen in a space. Biomedical is some, social is a lot as well. We might get into trouble because we don't know a lot about the biomedical. We're going to have to quickly upgrade ourselves on that, you know. But that's where we're going with this. And so this chapter in this book, thank you to the editors, is part of the process. Thanks.
Thanks very much. This is just a snapshot of the book and its themes. And as you can see, these, if I think about Anthony's chapter in terms of 2000 and where we are now in 2022, this is not to talk about a utopic future, but indeed the contradictions, but of course the possibilities. Katrina, your wonderful chapter on the toolkit, it's also about expanding the possibilities, if I take that theme, in terms of what might we take from where we are right now to develop a new ways of thinking about sexuality and trans allyship. That word allyship, despite those border work, the border crossings as well, and then the work in Southern Africa in terms of identifying Blessings and Nirvana, and Lenore and Alex, in terms of identifying these various areas of sexuality, which we don't know about in terms of a broader Southern African context, but also where we need to head.
Thank you, Mary and Divya and Peter, for inviting me to be part of this very great event, and that it's taking place at the Future Africa Center is really exciting to me too, because although I'm a historian, I like to think about my work as having the future in mind, and a future where people can feel they belong and their rights and dignities as people are accepted. So that isn't the case right now in much of the continent for many reasons, including sexuality and gender identity and expression. But I'd like to take a few minutes to speak about that and how this book fits in with that vision. So before I get there, though, I should say, one thing that Aminat and I say in the afterword to the book is that looking back to where we started, and by we, let's just say me, about 25 years ago or so. So the field has changed radically for the better is one of the key takeaways I make in the book. And that shows in a number of ways. Most obviously, back then, 25 years ago, hardly anyone was doing this. Honestly, we'll take, say, Defiant Desire as the first book focused on same-sex issues in South Africa, and that was 1994. So that's the first one. And then a number of people doing it was a trickle until very recently. And of that trickle, the overwhelming majority of researchers and authors publishing were either white South African or, more commonly, like myself, from away, from North America or Europe. And the number of Black Africans contributing as scholars to the debate was, basically zero. The very first Black that I can think of who contributed was Zaki Ahmad, and that was 1993, a very small review essay. The first Black man writing as a scholar, that is, to publish a monograph, I would say it was Thabo Msibi. That's 2018. So that's decades after the field got launched, right? And so that's changed radically for the better, that more and more, generally more product is out there from different places all over, not just South Africa anymore, everywhere. 2 new monographs just this year and last year from Ghana and Nigeria, and places you think of as really hostile to this type of research. We're seeing more and more coming out of there and produced by Africans, and that's a major bonus. And the other thing I'd have to say is too, and obviously connected to this, is that when I started, people said, basically, literally one person said to me, that can't be done because the sources, there's nothing there. And I'm speaking as a historian. Yeah, of course, you can go find people as a sociologist or an anthropologist or whatever, looking at the contemporary situation. You can do that, and I did a bit of that way back in the day. And the thing is that you can do that, and you'll find, generally speaking, young people who don't understand the history. So as a historian, people said, yeah, it can't be done. The sources are not there. And one thing we're seeing is, yeah, people are being creative about news sources and treating the production of knowledge in creative ways. And I don't mean that like just making stuff up. I mean, looking at literature, looking at poetry, looking at internet sources that just weren't there in the past. And so it's generated a flood of, well, not a flood, but a significant increase and creative thinking about sources. So that's a tremendous advance. And in terms of the political hostility, well, that hasn't necessarily gone in the right path everywhere. It has in some countries in a very interesting way, and in Southern Africa in particular, it's leading on the continent, with the exception of some of the island states, Lesotho, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, Botswana. They're all moving in a direction that South Africa pioneered many years ago, and that is to decriminalize, to destigmatize attitudes, and that is playing out in basically positive ways. So and all these things are connected, right? When I started, young Black African scholars, even if they were open-minded and wanted to do the research, had good reason to fear that they couldn't do it without being punished at work or ostracized as professionals. So that has really changed for the better in a lot of the region in Southern Africa anyways. And I would say, even wider, I was the regional associate editor for the LGBTQ histories, global histories. And one of the first things they said, well, we have to develop a list of topics. And at the group of all of us, the different regions, Asia, North America, et cetera, brainstormed, and I came up with 75 topics. And I thought, well, we could probably find 75 people for the whole of the region to write entries on these different topics. And then they said, well, okay, 75, we'll multiply that by 3, because what if you give me a name and that person can't do it, right? So I had to come up with 3 times 75. And actually, I was able to do that. Even in places, like I said, that you think, no, that's a hostile environment. You're never going to find people. Ethiopia, yes, we got someone, and no problem. So that's the political climate for doing this research has definitely changed for the better in some areas. Now, not all. That's definitely a big problem, and maybe I'll talk about that a little bit later. Anyways, just to conclude that, how it's changed for the better, I was just putting the finishing touches on a review essay of basically 10 monographs in the last 3 years, new publications on these topics from all over the place, including the first ever, if you can believe it, the first ever monograph on African women having intimate erotic relations with African women. That was published last year. Talk about slow motion, but it's there now. So there's 10 monographs, there's about a dozen other amazing collections of new research, all in the past few years. So the floodgates are kind of open. And I should mention websites too. There's a new website, which again, it may seem amazing, and it will. In a few years, we'll look back and say, how did that take so long? A website devoted to trans and intersex issues, which often get overlooked, and intersex often, to the extent of not even being included as a token in an acronym. But now there's a whole website devoted to that. So that was launched like last week. So all this is really, really positive and exciting. And I should stress, this book too is part of that exciting trend, featuring, among others, young African scholars who are taking up the research challenges. So one other thing I'll say that's changed for the better, and again, it's manifest in this book, is that in the early days, and partly this is a result of the type of sources that we were able to find, like in my case, there was nothing in Zimbabwe on the topic of male sexuality. It just there was nothing except criminal court cases, and that's what I relied on. So by nature of the source, you're going to get it skewed towards unhealthy relationships, violent or accusatory or exploitative kind of relationships. So that wasn't only the nature of the sources. Partly, I'll say, we as scholars were possessed of a kind of sense of urgency because of the violence of the rhetoric. And the thing is, HIV was there in those days. There was no antiretroviral drugs. It was kind of pushing us to write in a way that emphasized the danger and the risks and the harms that were done by silence. Silence equals death is kind of coming from the 80s HIV awareness campaigns in the States and elsewhere. So we had a bit of that mentality to stress how bad things were or could be unless we act. And so that percolated into the scholarship in a way that unintentionally, I think in most cases, had a tendency to well, first of all, to generalize about the whole of Africa as one place, and all of it is homophobic in a uniform way. And also, to pathologize Africans, and particularly African men, as a source of danger and a lack of the complexity of human emotions, right? So that kind of, I would say, very much unintentionally, by the first generation of scholars, was a negative thing. And this book, as well as some of the monographs I was just talking about, challenged that very, very significantly by focusing on intangibles like love and other emotions, or masculine vulnerability. It's often assumed that men and boys are like rocks or steel, and they'd have nothing but their phallus to guide their decision-making processes. But when we look closely and we talk to them, and you find that they're often insecure and fearful, and some of the decisions which the early generation of scholarships would say, well, that's patriarchal rubbish and exploitation of women and this and that. And I'm not saying that isn't there, but we need to be sensitive to some of the other factors that are propelling some of these behaviors that should make us more empathetic going down the road. So that I'd say, in terms of challenges, that's a big one. How do you excavate that stuff? I mean, yes, in the present, you can talk to people, and there's technologies that are there now that invite people to be really honest without the fear of stigmatization. So the technologies have really advanced in a way that make the research into these intangibles more possible. So that's a challenge for the future, and it's a way to go, because it's obvious we have to work with every ounce of our dedication as scholars against some of these stigmatizing, otherizing, pathologizing characterizations of Africa and Africans, which still, unfortunately, we find there in a lot of the mainstream, not just in the West, in the mainstream media, but it's often there passively, even in well-intentioned international organizations, multinational banks, and this and that may unintentionally recreate these images, and sometimes in a passive way, that we as scholars have to do our best, our utmost, to fight against that. And so getting at those intangibles, emotions, the complexities, nuances. Yes, it makes the story more complicated. In fact, all of these monographs I'm just talking about recently published, they're all complicating the narrative. They're all saying, you know, this idea of, it used to be called gay identity migration, the assumption being that the kind of Western gay stereotype in its own right, identity that you see on display in San Francisco or New York or Toronto or Melbourne, you know, that's going to migrate around the world. Eventually, the whole world is going to be homogenous in that sense. Well, all of these books and the scholarship in this book to challenge that and saying, you know, around Africa, there's very different identities, and it may be strategically quite wise for people who feel you know, non-normative gender or sexuality, and they may be comfortable with that in themselves. But the coming outside of things, which is kind of de rigueur in the West, it doesn't make sense in the context where they're living. And for a number of reasons, cultural and family and church, all those things are really important to people, probably more so than in the West. So making the narrative more complicated, suggests more complicated politics, you know, and so we need to be astute in thinking about all that. So bringing all that in, pleasure, intimacy, emotions, masculine vulnerability. I mentioned faith. That's something that is quite clear that we as scholars tend to be secular minded in our understanding of these things, and sometimes that just isn't the main factor in people's decision making. Rather, this monograph I mentioned by Thabo Msibi, you find that his informants are stressing their main identity isn't their sexuality, their source of, you know, who they are, but it's their faith and their membership in the church or family. And so stressing sexuality as the core of our humanness may not always work. And so that's an interesting lesson to learn, and a big challenge if we're talking, you know, the politics of human rights and such. So for the future, I guess, all kinds of things to think about. Sources. There's a big one. I've already said, you know, we're expanding what we look at and we take as legitimate source. We can look at movies. There's been a lot of movies, videos. There's a really interesting bunch, you know, from Kenya. There's a rap video celebrating same-sex relationships and loving same-sex relationships. So we can look at all these different sources. But one big challenge, and I say this as a historian, it scares me to think about it. Who's archiving all this stuff? You know, encrypted messages on WhatsApp. How are we going to decipher that? How are we going to know what's true when so much of what is being written in secretive ways that are extremely ephemeral? WhatsApp, chat, Snapchat, you know, that exists for a matter of seconds even. So how are we going to know with confidence that something really happened? And especially when we take into account all these deep fake things. So I guess the challenge going forward is for us as scholars, we're going to have to ramp up our techno confidence to deal with some of these issues. And since I mentioned language, that's another big one. There's still the tendency overwhelmingly for this knowledge production is in English. And that may increase even with the internet as a kind of global, marketplace of ideas in English, overwhelmingly. That may change, who knows, but as it's going, that seems to be the trend, you know, and then how do we work against that? So we need to promote the next generation of scholars who are doing work, and not just in African languages. Obviously, it needs to be in African languages, including, you know, Swahili as a kind of a regional language, but other colonial languages, even Portuguese. There's hardly anything. There's a few things starting to come out. but I would say that's got to be big in the region. You know, Mozambique and Angola are ahead of the curve for decriminalizing the inherited colonial laws, not counting South Africa. So why don't we have more discussion of what's going on in those countries? Of course, there are political factors, but the linguistic barrier is something that we can address pretty easily. So, yeah, and the other thing to be aware of there too, and there's a new book there by Ian Edwards and myself on a kind of, we'd say anachronistically, we could say a trans community in Durban back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. So their language ostensibly was is Zulu, right? They spoke Zulu, but there was a secret language as well, and deciphering that. So you need to not only have access to the African language, you need to have the gay argot embedded within that. And so that's so there's a challenge. How do you get to know that? Well, you need to bring on board LGBT folks themselves and youth who are often at the cutting edge of these new languages, secret languages. And so bring them in as part of the research project, not as just objects to be studied, but as active participants in a way that hopefully, I think we as scholars, this is a challenge, and I do see it in a number of very interesting cases where scholars bring the people they're writing about in as co-producers of the knowledge, and that's a really tough one to do, I have to say. But anyways, let me wrap it up with just one final thought. We bring in all these other kind of cultural sources, and we're talking about intimacy and emotions, and you know, that's really easy to get bogged down in that kind of stuff without, and I don't mean that in a negative way, without keeping one foot based in the world of the political economy. And that means whatever we do, and this is a challenge, I would say, if we're talking about a rap video, how do we contextualize that in what's happening with the wider political economy that's causing people stress, in most cases, I would say, especially these days. Yeah, and maybe the last point there to keep in mind, again, as scholars, you know, the traditional way of publishing and disseminating knowledge has changed a lot, and we need to be on the ball about that, you know. And just one example, you know, the publishing industry has become corporatized in a big way, and they maintain monopolies on access to this new knowledge, and we have to fight against that. So I would say, as a challenge, us as knowledge producers, how do we make this stuff available to a wider audience in Africa? And we can do that through open source. Technology is there. It's going to cost us because, you know, that isn't free. The purveyors, the owners of these platforms want, you know, they want to make a profit, not simply to raise consciousness. That's not, you know, maybe it never was there, but at the early days, we used to believe that putting knowledge out there, you publish a book and it'll get picked up and debated in a kind of open way. That's not necessarily the case anymore. So we have to make a concerted effort to do that. But I think it's possible. It can be done. And it is happening, and this is all a great moment, and I'm so happy to have been invited to talk about it and share my optimism and to join in celebrations of this great book. So thanks a lot.
At this point, I open the floor. There is a mic that is rotating or revolving around here. I open up the floor for questions to our panelists, and you also have a mic here, and you can just rotate that around. Okay, so there is a question. Whose hand up was first? Rebecca. Oh, and then there's a question right on the top.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the speakers for a wonderful panel. My question is about some of the themes that were touched on in Professor Pumla's presentation, principally on sexual wildness and on difficult pleasure. And it comes to a point that Katrina has made about sexual socialization, and it's about a topic that is so important in the sexual socialization of young South Africans, but is so rarely written about, except by Divya Bana and the late Nicole Carboni, and that's on pornography. So my question is perhaps to Blessing and Nirvana pointedly, but to all panelists, what is the role of pornography on the changing sexual imaginary in South Africa and sexual socialization of young people particularly?
We'll do two at a time, yeah.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for this especially invigorating, enthralling event. It's more fun of the longer events I've had at Future Africa. So my question is around more particularly Pumla Kola's conversation starting points, but it's not particularly linked to, not particularly pointed to you. But my question is around the agenda of trans identities and inclusivity in literature. So I'm also now going to speak about curriculums not only in high schools and primary, but also in higher education. How do we treat or include or involve trans-friendly literature that's inclusive at those different levels, right? Because it's always seen as a by the way. So I remember, popular canons in first year, because I graduated in English Lit, you learn about all the old white men who started, they claim, all the Englishes under the sun, and then only if you do post-grad, you get this beautiful African Lit, you start engaging with your Linda Spencer's, at a later stage of your more refined sort of dedicated work in academia. So I'm just worried that in those formative years or reformative years, if that's what undergrad is called or perceived as, how do we integrate this, especially in light of allyship? Because if you're a lecturer who's not in the queer community, how much of it is going to be your department pushing you to do this? And how much of it is going to be you sort of trying to collect all this information that we've shared? And in your conversation, Pumla, you said you're not going to mention certain things because you will take granted that this really powerful room already understands the sort of things we take for granted. So yeah, a bit long, but I hope I made sense.
Okay, so I'm going to open that to the panel, and I think that immediately the last question is Pierre and Landa, because perhaps you could answer that. And then Rebecca's question about porn. I just leave it to the panel who would like to answer that. Of course, I could say a lot, Rebecca. Yeah.
I think I'm going to do a classic politician stunt, which is to say, your question made me think of something I've really been wanting to say, which is along the lines of, I was saying to Landa sitting here, do we want to talk about porn in relation not only to it clearly is a source of sex education, which is often quite worrying, but it is so ubiquitous. I think we have to accept that we have to engage with porn. But I think what is interesting around is the fetishization of trans bodies in porn. And I wondered if you had a thought about that you'd like to share.
Yeah, so I think that in and of itself makes for, it's an important part of what should be included in terms of scholarship. I do think trans bodies are, seen as a fetish in primary spaces even, and I think the thinking about porn and thinking about trans, sort of that linkages to gender diverse bodies, let me say, and how they are fetishized. It's an uncomfortable reality, but it is a reality nonetheless. And perhaps it requires a lot of sort of reflexivity and thinking about how it can probably, to some degree, call to question the ethics around that or lack thereof, and how it can also, premise what needs to shift or needs to be reimagined in terms of how we view and embody out of the boxes. I don't know if I'm making sense, but the different and uncomfortable ways that human beings view and interrogate bodies and what they deem bodies to quench in terms of what they would like to experience. Yeah.
I do want to add to the curriculum question. And I want to say that our broader curriculum in higher education is still very heteronormative. And issues around sexual and gender diversity has been reduced to the space of gender studies. And outside that, there's no engagement with this topic. And perhaps those within gender studies and sexual studies are somehow responsible because we hardly work in a transdisciplinary space. We hardly work with mining to say, what is it like when we have a transgender person who's doing engineering in mining? And so there's a need for transdisciplinary work already at undergraduate level so that this discourse of gender and sexuality is normalized across the body of knowledge and not contained within a discipline of gender studies.
I hope, Peter, you're still online, and because this is exactly the sort of a vibrancy that we wanted to pick up on in terms of what this book might do to thinking about new ideas and new ways of thinking beyond what we currently know. So thanks very much for that. And of course, the question on porn. It's horrifying when you consider it. It's calls into question respectability.
You know, I'm familiar with late Nikki's work and kind of where it was situated. And I think in our chapter, and because we focused on sexual and reproductive health and rights, I mean, you find that it's hugely excluded and sexual pleasure is largely missing from the literature, it's missing from the kind of public health agenda, from, all those things. And then in my personal work as well on early motherhood, it was largely sexual pleasure, and pornography was largely missing from many of the from the narratives that I had from young women or young mothers. And instead, sex was often described as rushed. And I mean, it was situated in informal townships. So, it was questions of space, it was questions of privacy, it was questions of possibly, speaking to someone that's older and not being comfortable to speak around, questions of pornography or pleasure, etc. But yeah, it didn't feature much in my work. And yeah, I think it's an area that needs to be examined a lot more.
So just to add on, in terms of wildness and sexual pleasure and desires, for me, most of the work that I did with young women, and in particular those women that had access to more like enclosed spaces when it came to coming of age. So within our different African societies and communities, we have programs that we put across for women or young men who are coming of age, and we invite them to different huts so that we can have heart-to-heart talks about what it means to grow up and what it means to be a sexual being. It is within those small spaces, enclosed spaces, that young girls are able to explain and are able to open up and really talk in depth about their sexual desires and sexual wildness, and the idea that they're also able to learn from older women about how to carry themselves and how to respond, or how to relate with others in terms of really explaining what it means to be a woman in Africa and what it means to be a woman within their own ethnicities, and how to talk in depth and really be open about being a sexual being. So these issues are mainly talked about within enclosed spaces and not in the public. Yep, I'll stop there.
So let's open it up for more questions. Okay, we have two here. Any other questions? Okay, the mic. The below and then
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for a fascinating panel, and thanks to Prof. Gola for her brilliant keynote. And I actually wanted to pose the question to her. She's busy shaking her head. But as you were giving your keynote, Prof, at the back of my head, of my mind, I kept thinking of course, your seminal book, A Female Fear Factory, that in terms of writing difficult pleasures, the fear factory is there, where women police themselves, even in the act of writing. And I was wondering, what are some of the strategies that you have discovered along the way? I mean, it's taken you how many years? 20 years to finally, put down Female Fear Factory, which is a very brave, award-winning book already, So what are some of the strategies that women use to, break through that fear factory to write these difficult pleasures? Does it have to be in the company of women in an anthology? Does it have, so what are some of the strategies? Because I don't think it's easy work. It can often be very chaotic and even dangerous work, dare I say.
So
we
could just take the next question, and then
I
we'll
also just ask a question to panelists.
Okay.
My question is for Professor Brown. And it's so you talk about how, it's probably an unfair question, but maybe I'm piggybacking on your work to try and figure something out that I'm finding enormous difficulty understanding. And so it felt like a similar project. So on the one hand, you talk about the way in which there is there's a relative openness in terms of people's social and everyday responses to gender diversity, to sexual varied sexual expression on the one hand. So there isn't at least kind of a sedimented sense of people being policed in kind of everyday kind of senses. On the other hand, there is the reticence. No, that's probably I'm being too kind. There's kind of hostility, or there's a refusal to enable or to allow to, I don't know what the word is. I'm policing. I'm like, no, wrong word, wrong. When people any recourse to kind of state services, you use the police and health services, that should theoretically then be accessible, because the people who are staffing those places are also part of the same societies, is often met with refusal and hostility. And I wonder, I don't think what you're saying is that, yeah, well, I mean, state organs simply just fail, and I don't think you talk about it in terms of failure. But I wonder if you can say a little bit about what your sense is of what is going on there. I mean, of course, I'm trying to figure out why it is that both are possible, why it is that we both have this sense of seeming laid-backness and this absolute refusal to perform that openness to its logical conclusion when it comes to issues specifically, I think you said specifically around issues of safety. Yeah, so I don't want to. And then, sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, I don't want to hoard space. I've already.
There's somebody else behind you. Yeah.
I'll hold myself.
Okay. Yeah, the green.
All right. Thank you very much. This was mind-blowing. So there's just a couple of aspects that so many people have mentioned that are kind of leading towards my question. I mean, if we're saying and we're speaking of futures, and we're speaking of reimagining where we come from or where we are right now and how to get to a better place. And yet at the same time, we keep in mind how systems are continuously at play and even legitimized in systems such as education, for Pete's sake, you know, where the illegitimate becomes so legitimized through everyday systems. At the same time, you know, we mentioned how we cannot really be too focused on individualized problems, that we need to look bigger, because as soon as we try and fight the individual, I understand that the system continues. And now I'm sitting here wondering, how then, and especially within the context, I'm sorry, this is a very selfish question because this is a question that I'm dealing with. So how do we sit then, especially in the context within violence against women, that is an immediate problem, that is our lived everyday reality, where we are right now. It is, you know, it is where we currently are, and as Prof. Gola earlier mentioned, that it's this schema that exists at the same time, in the same moment, where we want to be over it, and we don't want to pinpoint individuals, right? However, and we want to highlight systems. However, individuals are the ones that are at play every time and every system. How then do we highlight and deconstruct and discuss such issues where the beneficiaries of these systems are constantly at play, and yet we still need to destroy the system and speak to the system? I don't know if that makes sense.
So, Pumla's question, can we hold on with that? And we'll get to the panel to answer the two questions from the last speaker and Pumla's question to the panel. Is that fine? Okay. So Pumla's question and then the last question.
I think it's a very challenging question that you are asking. But in my own mind, making sense of this question, in the most simplistic way of responding to you without thinking now, I'm thinking it's the interplay of power. There are those who, with the moratorium on the sodomy law, claim that, oh, okay, so this is not an issue in Namibia anymore. We have rights. So they push from the inside and claim their position, claim their identity, claim their citizenship, although, Prof, it's a very complex term, citizenship. And so they claim the space to say, we are one Namibia, one nation, I belong in this country and I have equal rights. But there are those who still hold to the power that says, this is un-African, this is not who we are, this is unbiblical, and they push from the outside. And so there's a push from the inside and the outside, and there's this dance going on. We claim our power, we take the power. You don't have power, you don't have rights, we claim our rights. So there's this constant play, and as long as we have the sodomy law in Namibia that's still unrepealed, we will have that kind of dance. However, there's another element that interplays here. It is the silences, and as the colleague upstairs said, that in health education, in police services, do we educate them about this, about sexual and gender diversity, or is this knowledge captured only in the discourse of gender studies? And so we claim rights, but they don't understand why these rights are claimed. And giving an education with the rights will probably move the system into a more egalitarian space.
Go ahead, Katrina.
Can I want to link these questions to your own presentation. Because one of the things that struck me really sort of between the eyes was the question of how do you deal with being hyper visible and invisible at the same time? That contradiction, and that's exactly the kind of contradiction that you talk about. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking about hypervisibility and invisibility as states, okay? But there's also hypervisibilizing and invisibilizing as processes, as interactions, as spaces where things happen. And it's exactly that kind of the one or the other, and then we sit in the middle, and what is the space that occupies? And it reminds me, as you were talking about that, of the Derridean notion of undecidability. And how undecidability is very difficult because it has to be decided one way or the other. And then I wondered to myself, but can undecidability be a space of wildness, of something different? So not, and I'm trying to link it to the, tolerance versus kind of, neither is actually okay. Tolerance or hostility, actually, in the end, they do the thing of exoticizing or pathologizing. So I mean, I don't think I'm coming to any particular answer, but these things are all connected. This kind of, the binaries that we're trying to kind of work beyond and through and under and over, and that's a very difficult space. So some of the work that you were talking about, I think, is really important, and the kinds of struggles, the day-to-day struggles that people are doing and claiming, and then finding that in claiming that they are struggling with it. If I may really, really quickly just say, one of the things that we've always got to link individual violence to is exactly the same as why we need to problematize women's football. Exactly, precisely. And it's all linked. You never, when you watch the news, they won't talk about, it's men playing, it's football. If it's women's playing, it's women's football. And that's all. Until we talk about football as football, whether it's women, whomever, whatever genders they are on the field, then we will continue with exactly the same. Violence will continue.
I want to conclude by thanking the audience. The vote of thanks will be conducted by Mary Crew. But I want to just thank the panel for your sterling remarks and engaging discussions. In fact, I would think that this is really the highlight of any event, this sort of, toing and froing with questions and the responses. So thank you so very, very much for your discussion and your very enlightening ways in which we're still building our knowledge around sexuality. And so in terms of what the book does is precisely this. It's not about creating the binary between dystopia and utopia, and that's your question. We are right here entangled in the here and now, and that in the here and now we are suffering we're suffocating, and I'm using that notion of the air. We're suffocating the rhetoric around, these binaries, these racialized constructions of sexuality, the ways in which sexuality continues to be focused on danger without ever dismissing the fear factory, Pumla. That word is just so powerful because that still exists, and we need to keep in tension, and these entanglements pervade our everyday lives because sexuality is part of the everyday life. And so we also attack that spectacle of suffering nonetheless. And Katrina, I love the words, the wildness, Because I think that's what we are trying to generate here, something new. Not in a utopic sense, but something different. What more can we do? How can we expand what we currently know of? How do we think differently? What theoretical resources are we developing and thinking through to enable us to see what we might not have yet seen? This sort of push-pull that you were talking about. And so at this point, I am handing over to Mary, and I really want to say thank you so very much for your participation.
So I'm not going to add to anything that has been said in terms of the thanks, but there are, of course, people who have to be thanked beyond my co-editors and the guest speaker. Thank you very much, and Prof. Coupe and Prof. Reddy, who've gone off to other functions. I would also like to thank Daneline very much. I know this is a very difficult job, and I know you had people telling you to do one thing and then asking you to do another, but really thank you. Neither of us were here in Pretoria, and so it was really good that you were there, and thank you. And then to Sarah, who's not with us, from Routledge, who, as working with the editors, was an absolute pleasure. And Sarah, I don't know if you are tuned in or if you're still here, but really thank you very much. It was delightful working on this book, even though every now and then we had authors who we thought, oh dear God. I'm not looking in anybody's direction. But it really was great. And I have to say that finally, and out of some kind of control, which has got nothing to do with Future Africa, the books have arrived. They are available, they're being sold. I know they are a little bit pricey, but if you have research grants or something that you can put it to, or put it on a 12-month budget or even a 24-month budget, I'm sure you will be able to get it. And then finally, to say that there will be a great deal of food, because we catered for the RSVPs, in the dining hall there, and there will also, thanks to UP's slightly more liberal policies than UKZN's, there will also be wine. So please come and join us, and I'm sure that the authors and the speakers will be really happy to continue to engage this discussion over what will be really nice food and wine. And for those of you who came, who told me that you were simply coming because you knew there would be food and wine, that moment has arrived. Thank you very much.